Have you ever felt betrayed, abandoned, or forgotten by the very people you trusted? Take a moment and reflect on that question. Has there been a time in your life when you gave your heart to someone, only to have them turn their back on you? Or when you poured everything you had into a dream, only to see it fall apart? Perhaps you've been through a season where it felt like everything you worked for, everything you believed in, was torn down by the very people you thought would support you. The pain is real. The betrayal is deep. And in that moment, the tears you shed feel like they'll never end. But I want to tell you something important. Joseph's story isn't just a story of betrayal. It's a story of redemption, resilience, and victory. Joseph's tears, his sorrow, were not the end of his story. They were simply the beginning of something greater. What you might not realize is that your tears today could be the seeds of your triumph tomorrow. Let's talk about Joseph, the young man who, despite being deeply hurt, betrayed, and abandoned by his own flesh and blood, would go on to change the course of history. Joseph's life is a powerful example of how adversity can be transformed into victory. When you read Joseph's story, you can't help but feel the depth of his emotional journey. At the age of 17, he was his father's favorite son, a young dreamer who had big plans for his future. But his brothers, filled with jealousy, took matters into their own hands. They betrayed him. They sold him into slavery. They threw him into a pit and left him to die. Can you imagine the hurt? The deep sorrow that must have filled his heart? The loneliness of being abandoned by the very people he loved and trusted? But that wasn't the end of Joseph's story. It was just the beginning of his greatest transformation. Joseph's tears were not a sign of defeat. They were a sign of what was coming, a sign that God was shaping something bigger in him. In those moments of betrayal and sorrow, Joseph was being molded, prepared, and positioned for the greatness that lay ahead. So let me ask you again, are your tears the end of your story? Or are they the beginning of something greater, something powerful? In moments of pain and adversity, tears are a natural response. Tears are the body's way of processing pain, sorrow, and loss. They give us the release we need when words fail. But here's the thing. What if those tears weren't meant to drown you? What if instead they were meant to water the seeds of greatness that are deep within you? Sometimes we view our tears as signs of weakness, but in the Bible, we see a different picture. Tears are not always weakness. They can be a sign of growth. They are an indication that something inside you is being broken open so that something more beautiful and more powerful can emerge. Joseph's tears, though painful and filled with grief, were the very thing that prepared him for what was to come, a place of power, influence, and purpose. T.D.JAKES often talks about how pain is part of the process. In his sermons, he teaches that pain is not the enemy of purpose. It's the tool God uses to refine us. Joseph's pain didn't destroy him. It transformed him. The tears he shed, the hurt he endured, those things didn't break him. They made him. They made him the leader he was meant to be. And the same is true for you. So if you're watching this and you're going through your own season of pain, remember this. Your tears are not the end of your journey. They are part of God's process to take you to a place of victory. I want you to open your heart right now and receive this message with full faith and belief. What you're going through today is not the final chapter of your story. This is not the end. This is just the beginning. You are not defeated. You are not forgotten. You are being prepared for something bigger than you can imagine. Your tears today are watering the seeds of tomorrow's triumph. God is working behind the scenes even when you can't see it, and He's setting you up for a victory that is far greater than your pain. So stay with me, because this journey is not just about survival. It's about victory after adversity. It's about learning to see your tears as a sign that God is not done with you yet. In the next few minutes, we're going to dive deeper into Joseph's story and explore how his tears, his pain, and his journey of transformation led him to a place of power and purpose. And through this, I believe you will find hope, strength, and courage for whatever challenges you're facing today. Stay tuned. Victory is on the way. Joseph's journey, the betrayal. Let's go back in time. Imagine a young man, only 17 years old, living in a world full of dreams, potential, and hope. His name is Joseph, and in his father's eyes, he is the beloved son, the one who's special, the one who's chosen. His father Jacob had 12 sons, but Joseph was his favorite. Jacob loved him so much that he made him a richly ornamented coat, a coat of many colors, which became a visible symbol of his favor. Now to the outside world, this seemed like a beautiful thing, a father's love for his son. But to Joseph's brothers, it was something else: jealousy, resentment, envy. How could their father love Joseph more than them? How could Joseph, the youngest of them all, be treated as though he were more deserving of love and attention? Joseph wasn't just the recipient of his father's favor, he was also a dreamer, a visionary. Joseph had dreams that he believed were from God. In one of these dreams, he saw himself as a leader, someone who would rise above his family. In his dream, his brothers' sheaves of wheat bowed down to his. In another, the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed down to him. Now imagine the tension that must have been building in that family. Joseph, the youngest, receiving all the attention and favor from his father, and then sharing dreams that suggested he would one day rule over them. To his brothers, this wasn't a dream. It was a threat. It was the final straw in their hearts, the spark that would ignite a fire of jealousy and anger. One day, Joseph's father sends him out to check on his brothers who are tending the flocks. As Joseph approaches, his brothers begin to plot. They see him coming from a distance in his multicolored coat, and that's when their plan takes shape. They grab him, rip off his coat, and throw him into a dry pit, planning to leave him there to die. The brothers sit down to eat, completely indifferent to the suffering of their own flesh and blood. But one brother, Reuben, wants to save him, so they decide to sell Joseph to a passing caravan of Ishmaelite traders. They sell their brother, the one they were supposed to protect and love, for a handful of silver. The brothers return home with Joseph's coat smeared with goat's blood, and they deceive their father, leading him to believe that Joseph has been torn apart by a wild animal. And in that moment, Jacob, heartbroken, devastated, and inconsolable, believes he has lost his son forever. Loneliness, abandonment, rejection. What was going through Joseph's mind as he sat in that pit, knowing that his own flesh and blood had turned on him? What did it feel like to be betrayed by those you trusted most? Have you ever experienced something like that? Have you ever trusted someone with your heart, only to have them turn their back on you? Have you ever given everything, only to have it thrown back in your face? Joseph knew that pain all too well. Joseph's loneliness must have been overwhelming. He was in that pit alone, abandoned, rejected, not by strangers, but by his own brothers. He was rejected by his family, the people who were supposed to stand by him, the people who were supposed to protect him. But that wasn't the end of his rejection. Joseph was taken to Egypt, a foreign land, far from his home and family, where he was sold as a slave. He was placed into the house of Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's guard, and even in this new environment he would feel the sting of being an outsider, the sting of not belonging, the sting of rejection, the sting of abandonment, and the deep sorrow of being misunderstood and isolated. But let me tell you this: Joseph's pain wasn't the end of his story. It wasn't even the beginning of the end. It was the beginning of something much bigger than he could have imagined. Now, I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you loved and trusted? Has someone you called a friend, a family member, or a partner ever let you down in ways that hurt you so deeply you thought you would never recover? I know you've felt the weight of rejection. I know you've felt the sting of abandonment. Maybe it wasn't from your family like Joseph's, but I'm sure you can relate. There's something about betrayal, something about being forsaken by those closest to you that cuts deep into your soul. It feels like the wound will never heal. It feels like the pain will never go away. But here's the truth. Betrayal often comes before the breakthrough. Just like Joseph, sometimes the betrayal, the pain, the tears, the sorrow, becomes the very thing that positions you for your future. Joseph's brothers had no idea that in selling him into slavery, they were setting him on a path that would eventually lead him to greatness. They had no idea that their betrayal would be the stepping stone to Joseph's promotion. We often see betrayal as the end of something beautiful, but God sees it differently. He sees it as the prelude to something greater. God uses betrayal, rejection, and sorrow as part of His divine plan to elevate us, refine us, and prepare us for what's ahead. Sometimes God allows betrayal because He knows what's on the other side of it. He knows that on the other side of the pain, there's a crown waiting for you. So if you're in a season where you feel rejected, abandoned, or betrayed, don't lose heart. Your tears are not the end. They are the watering of the seed that will grow into something beautiful. Joseph's tears were not signs of weakness, but of the depth of his emotional capacity for greatness. Joseph's tears were not a symbol of defeat. They were the beginning of his transformation. Those tears, the pain, the sorrow, it was all part of God's process. God was building something in Joseph. He was developing his character, his resilience, and his ability to lead. Joseph's emotional pain was a sign of something deep within him, the capacity for greatness. It was in that pain that he would discover the power of forgiveness, the strength of his character, and the depth of his faith. Joseph's journey shows us that our tears aren't wasted. God uses them to refine us. He uses our struggles to build our capacity for greatness. So when you're going through moments of betrayal, abandonment, or rejection, don't think that your tears are a sign of weakness. Think of them as the soil from which your purpose will grow. The pit, the breaking point. Joseph, once the favored son, dressed in his beautiful coat of many colors, is now betrayed by the very brothers he loved. They have stripped him of his coat, the symbol of his father's affection, and thrown him into a dark, empty pit. A pit so deep it seems to swallow everything, leaving Joseph in a place of complete helplessness and hopelessness. The pit was not just a physical place, it was a symbolic space where Joseph's dreams, his hopes, and his future were all left to rot. In this pit, Joseph was completely alone. Have you ever found yourself in a place where the weight of rejection and betrayal felt unbearable? A place where you felt completely forgotten, abandoned, and isolated from the world? Perhaps you felt that same way when things seemed to fall apart, and you thought that the very future you had once dreamed of was slipping away from your grasp. For Joseph, this pit wasn't just a place where his body was confined. It was a place where his spirit was broken and where fear and uncertainty took root in his heart. The weight of the moment must have felt so heavy. Fear of the unknown, hopelessness about the future, loneliness so deep that it seemed as though no one could understand the pain he was going through. Joseph had trusted his brothers. He had believed that no matter what, family would always be there. But in the pit he realized that trust had been shattered, and now he was alone in a foreign place, far from his home, far from his father's love. Key emotions, hopelessness, isolation, fear of the unknown. At that moment, Joseph must have asked himself, "How did I get here?" Have you ever been in a situation where you felt like everything was falling apart and you couldn't see the way out? Where the circumstances were so dark, so difficult, that you wondered if you would ever rise above it? Joseph's pit was a place of hopelessness. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, and mental. It's one thing to be in a bad situation and know that there's a way out. But when you're in a pit, when everything around you seems to offer no escape, it's easy to feel like your purpose has been lost and your dreams are dead. It's here, in the pit, that we feel the weight of isolation the most. Joseph must have felt abandoned, not just by his brothers, but by the world itself. In those moments of suffering, we often ask, "Where is God in all of this? How can I possibly get out of this mess?" Fear of the unknown can paralyze us. Joseph didn't know where his life was headed. He didn't know if he'd ever see his family again. All he knew was that his life had taken a devastating turn, and the path forward seemed impossible. But what if, just maybe, God works His greatest miracles in the darkest moments of our lives? What if the pit is not the end, but the beginning of a transformation that will lead to something greater than we can even imagine? Think about your own lowest point. We all have moments in life where we feel as though we've hit rock bottom. Maybe it's a failure that shattered your confidence. Maybe it's the loss of a job, a relationship, or a loved one. Maybe you've experienced betrayal in the same way Joseph did. Or maybe you felt completely abandoned by the people who were supposed to support you. Can you remember a time when you were at your lowest? That moment when it felt like everything was falling apart and you didn't know how you would ever get through it? Here's something I want you to understand. Sometimes our lowest points are the very places where God does His most powerful work in our lives. It's in these moments of pain, fear, and confusion that God begins to prepare us for something greater. He's not absent in our darkest moments. In fact, He's often working behind the scenes, shaping us, molding us, and positioning us for our future purpose. Joseph didn't know it at the time, but that pit wasn't the end of his journey. It was the place where God would begin to prepare him for something far greater. God had a plan for Joseph, even when he couldn't see it. And just like Joseph, God has a plan for you, even when your life feels like it's falling apart. The lowest points can be the very places where God sets the stage for your elevation. Now let me share a powerful truth with you. Sometimes God uses our lowest points to set us up for the highest points in our lives. What if the pit you find yourself in is not your final destination? What if this season of pain is preparation for the promotion that's coming? We often want to skip the pain and go straight to the blessing, but that's not how God works. Transformation happens in the struggle. It's in the breaking that we are made whole. The pit was where Joseph had no choice but to surrender his fear, his bitterness, and his sense of hopelessness. It was in the pit that God began to refine Joseph's character, testing his faith and building his strength. We often look at the pit as a place of failure, but the pit isn't the end. It's the beginning. It's the place where God works in you to bring out something new. Joseph didn't stay in the pit, and neither will you. God uses the pit to mold you, shape you, and prepare you for the destiny that's waiting on the other side. Joseph's pit experience was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of his rise to power. The darkness of the pit was the incubator for his future greatness. In that pit, Joseph's resilience was built, his faith was tested, and his trust in God grew. And when Joseph was finally pulled from that pit, he was no longer the same person. He was a man who had been transformed by the process. From the pit to Potiphar's house, resilience and temptation. Joseph's journey didn't end with the pit. In fact, the pit was just the beginning of a series of trials that would test Joseph's character, faith, and resilience. After being dragged out of that pit, Joseph was sold as a slave to an Egyptian officer named Potiphar. The pit didn't break him, but it brought out the strength that Joseph didn't even know he had. In Potiphar's house, Joseph started to rebuild his life. He worked diligently, showing integrity and wisdom in everything he did. Joseph's resilience is remarkable. He could have easily given up, resenting the world for what had happened to him. He could have allowed the betrayal of his brothers and the injustice of being sold into slavery to define his future. But Joseph refused to let his circumstances determine his destiny. Instead, he chose to rise above the pain and continue moving forward. He chose to maintain his integrity, to remain faithful to his principles, even when no one was watching. Joseph's story is a powerful lesson in resilience. It's a reminder that no matter how hard life gets, you can keep going. Even in the face of the greatest adversity, you can rise. And Joseph's rise wasn't just about escaping his situation. It was about growing through it, becoming a stronger, wiser man, prepared for the greatness that awaited him. This is where we can learn from Joseph. Resilience isn't just about enduring. It's about growing and evolving through the struggles. It's about deciding that the circumstances around you won't dictate your peace or your progress. As T.D.JAKES teaches, when life gets tough, it's not about what's happening to you. It's about what's happening in you. Life's storms are not meant to break you. They are meant to refine you. When you're in the midst of the storm, remember, your resilience in the face of adversity is the key to your future. God is using your struggles to strengthen you, to develop your character, and to make you the person He created you to be. Joseph's story isn't just a story of survival. It's a story of thriving despite the odds. But just when Joseph seemed to be on the upswing, life tested him again, this time through a temptation that would have brought most people down. Joseph had found favor in Potiphar's house. Everything Joseph touched seemed to prosper, and Potiphar recognized his wisdom and leadership skills. He entrusted Joseph with everything, but there was one thing Joseph could not control: the lustful advances of Potiphar's wife. Now let's pause here for a moment. Joseph was a young man, far from home in a foreign land. He had already experienced immense pain and betrayal. He had every reason to give in to the temptations that came his way. No one would have known. No one would have judged him. But Joseph's integrity was stronger than his circumstances. He refused to give in to Potiphar's wife's persistent advances, saying, "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Joseph's decision to refuse the temptation wasn't just about avoiding sin. It was about standing firm in his values and maintaining his character. It was a test of his loyalty, not just to Potiphar, but to God. And that decision, to stand firm in his principles, even when it wasn't convenient or easy, came with a price. Potiphar's wife, scorned by Joseph's rejection, falsely accused him of trying to assault her, and as a result, Joseph was thrown into prison. Betrayal, injustice, false accusations. Joseph faced all of these in one swift blow. Again, he found himself in a dark place, wrongly punished for doing the right thing. His refusal to give in to temptation did not bring him immediate reward. In fact, it seemed to bring him further down. But what Joseph didn't realize at that moment was that his integrity was setting him up for the very blessing he couldn't see yet. Temptation, standing firm in your values, integrity in the face of injustice. Joseph's story here is one that resonates deeply with many of us. How many times in our own lives have we been faced with temptation, with moments where doing the right thing meant facing more hardship and suffering? Joseph stood firm in his values even though it didn't bring him immediate rewards. And yet, his commitment to doing what was right, even when it was painful, ultimately honored God, and that's where his true strength lay. We often think that standing firm in our integrity and values will always lead to positive outcomes. But sometimes, doing the right thing doesn't bring immediate rewards. Sometimes it costs us something. But I want you to hear this loud and clear. God honors your integrity, and He will never leave you when you stand for what is right, even when it seems like no one is watching. Joseph's story challenges us to think, what will we do when we are tempted to compromise our values? When the pressure is on, and doing the right thing seems like the harder choice, will we choose to stand firm in our beliefs? Joseph's experience shows us that even in the face of betrayal and false accusations, God sees your integrity. He sees the choices you make when no one is watching. And in time, God will honor that faithfulness. Let's take a moment and ask you, have you ever made the right choice but still suffered for it? Yep. Maybe you chose to tell the truth and it cost you your job, your relationships, or your reputation. Maybe you did the right thing in a difficult situation, and yet the outcome didn't align with what you expected. You may have faced betrayal, isolation, or even injustice because of the choice you made. You stood for what was right, but the world still treated you unfairly. It's in these moments that we must remember that God sees the whole picture. Doing the right thing doesn't always bring immediate rewards, but it always brings God's favor in the end. Just as Joseph's rejection of Potiphar's wife didn't bring him immediate success, it was the key to the door that God would open for him later. God is watching over you in those moments of pressure. Your decision to maintain your integrity, even when it's tough, is not unnoticed. God sees the depth of your heart, and He honors you when you choose righteousness, even if it costs you. In time, He will reward you. Let me leave you with this powerful thought. It is in the moments of pressure where the best version of you is formed. When you are under pressure, that's when your true character comes out. It's in the moments of adversity and temptation that God molds you into the person He has destined you to be. Pressure refines you. It strengthens your resolve. It purifies your intentions. The best version of you doesn't come from a life of ease. It comes from a life lived through resilience, integrity, and the choice to stand firm in what is right, no matter the consequences. Joseph's journey from the pit to Potiphar's house wasn't easy. It was filled with temptation, betrayal, and moments of deep injustice. But through it all, Joseph's resilience and integrity were shaping him into the leader he was destined to become. His choices in the face of temptation didn't just define his character, they set the stage for his future promotion. And just like Joseph, the best version of you will be forged through the pressure. Stand firm. Trust God's process. The reward for your integrity and resilience is coming, and it will be greater than you could ever imagine. Joseph's imprisonment, silent tears, growing strength. Joseph's life took another devastating turn as he was unjustly thrown into prison. His rise in Potiphar's house had been swift, but his fall was just as dramatic. After Joseph's refusal of Potiphar's wife, he was accused falsely and thrown into an Egyptian prison. Now think about this for a moment. Joseph had done nothing wrong. He had stayed true to his values, maintained his integrity, and yet he found himself locked behind bars. Injustice, betrayal, abandonment. For many of us, this is a place we fear the most. Not necessarily a literal prison, but the emotional, mental, and spiritual prisons we sometimes find ourselves in. The places where we feel stuck. The moments in life where we're doing everything right, following God's will, staying faithful, and yet it feels like nothing is changing. We look around and see no progress, no way out. We may feel forgotten, alone, and sometimes hopeless. It's in these moments that Joseph's story speaks to us in the deepest way. Imagine Joseph sitting in that cold, damp prison cell. No one to talk to. No one to defend him. The dreams that had once seemed so bright now felt so far away. The pain of his tears was not just the result of his unfair imprisonment, but of the weight of his isolation. There were no friends, no family, no one to support him in his time of need. Just the cold, suffocating silence. His tears were silent, but they were also profound. Those tears were not wasted. They were not meaningless. Every tear was planting a seed for the future. Every moment of despair was building strength in Joseph that he would need for the great role God had prepared for him. His time in prison was not the end of his story, but it was a part of the process of transformation that had to happen. God was not abandoning Joseph. He was preparing him. Despair, loss of hope, uncertainty. Joseph's time in prison was filled with emotions that anyone who has faced a season of struggle or suffering can relate to. Despair, loss of hope, uncertainty. There was nothing in Joseph's present situation that indicated any hope for the future. In fact, everything around him seemed to say the opposite. How could someone as faithful and honorable as Joseph end up in such a horrible place? But in the middle of his struggle, something powerful was happening. Despair often comes when we feel that we've given all we have, and there's no reward. Joseph was a young man with dreams, with goals, and with a deep sense of purpose. But here he was, alone, in a dark place, far from everything he knew, experiencing the pain of abandonment and the sting of unfairness. For many of us, the experience of despair can feel like an overwhelming weight. We might ask ourselves, what's the point of continuing? What good is my faith if this is what I get in return? It's easy to want to give up when everything around us seems to be falling apart. Joseph's loss of hope in that prison could have been overwhelming. There was no sign of things getting better. The future looked uncertain. His dreams from years ago may have seemed impossible. In the natural, Joseph had every reason to give up, but instead, in the midst of his pain, Joseph chose to keep going. He kept holding on to his faith, kept honoring his integrity, and kept walking through the darkness because he knew his circumstances did not define his destiny. And that's the lesson for you today. Despair is not the end of your story. Loss of hope is not the final chapter. The place where you feel the most uncertain is where God can work the most powerfully. In the same way Joseph's imprisonment didn't define him, your circumstances don't define you. The choices you make during your struggle will determine your destiny. It's not the storm that destroys you. It's how you choose to respond to it. Can you relate to this? Have you ever found yourself in a prison of your own? A place where you feel trapped, stuck, and like the reward for all your hard work is just too far away? Maybe you're in a season where you feel like you've been doing everything right, yet nothing seems to change. You've been faithful, you've worked hard, you've done all the right things, but it feels like the doors are closed and the world is moving on without you. Joseph's story is a reminder that you are not alone. In your prison, God is not distant. He is working behind the scenes. He is preparing you for something far greater than you can see in this moment. Just as Joseph's time in prison was not wasted, neither is yours. Every moment of your pain is molding you for something more. Every tear is watering the seeds of your destiny. God sees you in your prison, and He's getting you ready for the palace that awaits you. Don't believe the lie that because you are in a season of struggle, God has forgotten you. Just because the breakthrough hasn't come yet doesn't mean it won't. God is using this season to prepare you for greatness. Just like Joseph, the pain and struggle you're going through now is part of the preparation for the next chapter of your story. God never wastes a season of suffering. He uses it to shape and refine you into the person He's called you to be. In the midst of Joseph's imprisonment, there's an incredible truth that we must hold on to. Joseph's pain did not break him. It molded him. Every tear Joseph shed, every moment of isolation, every hour in that dark prison cell was part of a larger plan. God was using that time to mold Joseph's character and prepare him for the great role He had destined for him. And I want you to hear this today. Your pain is not pointless. Your tears are not wasted. They are molding you, shaping you, and strengthening you for the greater calling God has on your life. Every trial you face is creating the person you need to be to walk into your destiny. Joseph's time in prison was not an accident. It was part of the process of God's plan. There was no shortcut to his promotion. He had to endure the pain. He had to endure the loneliness. He had to endure the silence. But it was in that silence that he was becoming the man God needed him to be. And it's the same for you. Your growth happens in the struggle. Every tear is transforming you. Every difficult moment is preparing you. God doesn't waste your pain. He uses it to prepare you for something greater than you can imagine. Joseph's pain did not break him. It molded him. Every tear was transforming him for the role God had prepared. The prison didn't break Joseph's spirit, it prepared him for the palace. God was working in the silence, working in the dark, working in the midst of Joseph's pain. And when the time was right, Joseph would emerge not as a broken man, but as the man God had fashioned him to be, stronger, wiser, and more prepared for the incredible future that awaited him. And just like Joseph, your pain will not break you. It will mold you. Keep trusting. Keep going, and know that God is using this time to shape you for the greatness He has in store for you. Your prison is just a place of preparation for the purpose God has prepared for you. Keep growing through the pain, because the best is yet to come. Divine timing. Joseph's rise to power. Now, after Joseph had spent years in prison, seemingly forgotten, something powerful began to happen. His moment, His divine appointment was coming. It was all about God's timing. It had been years of preparation, pain, and perseverance, but the moment Joseph was about to experience would change everything. His rise from the pit to power would begin with a single moment, the moment of divine timing. Joseph's ability to interpret dreams which had seemed like a gift forgotten in the depths of prison would now bring him before the most powerful man in the world, Pharaoh. It was a moment orchestrated by God's plan. Joseph didn't go searching for the palace. God brought him there. He didn't push himself into Pharaoh's presence. God opened that door. One of Pharaoh's officials, the cupbearer, remembered Joseph after he had interpreted his dream while in prison. Pharaoh himself had a troubling dream that no one could interpret. And that's when Joseph's gift, a gift that had been buried in the darkness of imprisonment, was finally brought into the light. Joseph's rise was not a coincidence. It was divine timing. Everything Joseph had gone through, the betrayal, the pit, the prison, was preparation for this moment. God had been working behind the scenes the whole time, even when it seemed like Joseph was forgotten and abandoned. The truth is, God never forgot Joseph, and he never forgets you. Joseph's rise wasn't just about his dream interpretation. It was about the wisdom and maturity he had gained from his years of struggle. God had used the time of hardship to prepare him for this pivotal moment, a moment that would elevate him not just in the eyes of Pharaoh, but in the eyes of the entire nation. Patience, timing, and the power of God's timing in our lives. Let's talk about patience for a moment. Patience is one of the hardest things to develop, yet it is often in the seasons of waiting that we experience the most growth. Joseph's life was marked by a long period of waiting. He didn't know how long he'd be in prison. He didn't know when his time would come. He only knew that he had to trust that God's timing was perfect. In the waiting, Joseph had to learn to trust God's timing even when everything in his circumstances screamed that nothing was moving forward. Think about it. For years, Joseph had been in prison, far from the dreams he had when he was young. But in that waiting, God was preparing Joseph in ways that would position him for greatness. God's timing is often different from our own. We want things to happen on our schedule. We want breakthroughs now. We want answers now. We want promotions now. But the reality is that God's timing is always perfect, and often, He waits until we are fully prepared for what He is about to release in our lives. The thing that Joseph did during those long years of imprisonment was he kept his character intact. He didn't turn bitter. He didn't give up on his dreams. He didn't let his circumstances dictate his actions. Joseph continued to serve faithfully even in prison, and when it was time, when God said it was his time, no one could hold him back. Not his brothers, not Potiphar's wife, not Pharaoh's officials. No one. In that moment, Joseph went from being a prisoner to being second in command over all of Egypt. He went from a place of being forsaken to a place of unparalleled influence and authority. But this didn't happen because Joseph forced it to happen. It happened because it was God's perfect timing. Think about your own life for a moment. Have you ever gone through a season where it felt like nothing was happening? Perhaps you've been working hard at something, waiting for a breakthrough or a promotion, and it feels like you're stuck. Maybe you've been faithful in your job, in your ministry, or in your relationships, but you're not seeing the results you hoped for. You might even be asking, God, why isn't this happening? Why does it feel like I'm stuck here forever? Joseph's life is a testament to the reality that waiting is never wasted. There are times when we don't see any movement, and we wonder if God has forgotten us. But just like Joseph, the very thing you think is holding you back could be the very thing that prepares you for your moment of breakthrough. Reflect on times when you thought things weren't moving forward, but later you realized it was preparation for something greater. Perhaps you've had a job that didn't seem to have much significance, only to find out that it gave you the skills you needed for the next opportunity. Maybe you've been in a season of loneliness, and only later did you realize that God was preparing your heart for something far bigger than you could have imagined. God's timing doesn't operate on our timetable. It operates on His, and His timing is perfect. When it's your time, no one can hold you back. God's timing is perfect. When it's your time, no one can hold you back. You may be in a season of waiting right now. It may feel like the doors are closed and the opportunities are out of reach. But remember this: when it's your time, no one can hold you back. Joseph's moment came after years of pain, waiting, and preparation. And when God opened the door, it was a door no one could shut. And the same is true for you. Your moment is coming. It may not be today, but it's coming. God is preparing you in ways you can't see right now. The lessons you're learning in this season are setting you up for the season that's to come. When it's time, when God says it's time, there will be nothing and no one that can stop you. No prison can hold you. No enemy can block your promotion. No setback can stop your comeback. Trust in God's timing. Keep serving, keep believing, keep trusting. And when your time comes, it will be your moment of divine elevation. The same God who brought Joseph from the prison to the palace will do the same for you. Your rise is coming. Keep walking by faith, keep trusting His plan, and know that when it's your time, no one can hold you back. Reconciliation, the power of forgiveness. Now, we arrive at one of the most powerful and profound moments in Joseph's journey, a moment that speaks not only to Joseph's strength but to the strength of his character and his relationship with God. After everything Joseph had endured, the betrayal, the abandonment, the imprisonment, it all came down to this moment, the moment of forgiveness. Joseph's brothers had come to Egypt seeking food during a time of famine. They had no idea that the man who held the power to grant them food was none other than their brother Joseph, the very brother they had once betrayed and sold into slavery. The table had turned. The young dreamer who had once been thrown into a pit now stood at the top of the world. He was second in command over all of Egypt, a ruler with all the authority and power he could possibly need to exact revenge on those who had wronged him. But Joseph, in the face of their humiliation and guilt, chose not to retaliate. He chose forgiveness. He revealed himself to his brothers and, instead of condemning them, he offered healing and reconciliation. In a powerful moment, Joseph said to them, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." Genesis 50:20. Joseph understood that forgiveness wasn't just about releasing his brothers from their wrongs. It was about releasing himself from the burden of bitterness, anger, and resentment. Forgiveness was the key to his peace. It was the key to his freedom. It was the moment that allowed him to move forward in his life, to let go of the past, and to step fully into the future that God had prepared for him. Forgiveness, reconciliation, healing. Forgiveness is one of the most challenging but also one of the most freeing acts we can engage in. Forgiving those who have wronged us is not about excusing their behavior. It's not about saying that what they did was okay. It's about acknowledging the pain, the hurt, the betrayal, and then choosing to release it. Joseph's forgiveness wasn't a simple decision. It was a transformative act that required him to look beyond his own pain and to trust that God had a greater plan. It's easy to forgive when it's small hurts, when it's minor offenses. But when you've been betrayed, when you've been left in a pit to die, when you've been falsely accused, the decision to forgive is radical. It's a choice that takes you to a higher level of emotional and spiritual maturity. Joseph chose to reconcile with his brothers. Reconciliation means that there is no longer a division. It means that, though there may have been pain in the past, there is now an opportunity for healing. In reconciliation, there is restoration, not just of relationships but of peace and joy that are often robbed by unforgiveness. Think about Joseph's life for a moment. If Joseph had held on to the bitterness of his betrayal, how different would his life have been? If he had chosen revenge over reconciliation, if he had let the pain of his past dictate his future, he would have been bound by his hurt and anger. But instead, Joseph made the choice to forgive, and in that moment, he set himself free. Forgiveness brought healing to his heart and peace to his mind. It allowed him to step into the fullness of God's plan for his life. Now, let's bring this to a personal level. Have you ever had someone betray you? Have you ever had someone hurt you so deeply that the thought of forgiving them seemed impossible? Maybe it's a family member who hurt you, a friend who betrayed you, or someone who abandoned you when you needed them most. The pain of betrayal runs deep, and it's not easy to forgive. But here's the truth. Unforgiveness is like a prison. It holds you captive. It chains your heart and mind to the past, and it prevents you from moving forward. Forgiveness, on the other hand, is the key that unlocks that prison door. Ask yourself, are there people in your life who you need to forgive in order to move forward? Are there past wounds that you've carried with you, like baggage that's weighing you down? What would it look like for you to let go of that bitterness and anger? Forgiveness isn't about excusing the other person's actions. It's about releasing yourself from the burden of bitterness. It may feel impossible at first, but forgiveness is the first step toward healing. And the more you forgive, the more freedom you will experience. Forgiveness doesn't just free the other person, it frees you. Joseph didn't need his brothers to ask for forgiveness for him to release them. Forgiveness was his choice, and in that choice, Joseph found peace. You can find that peace too. You can let go of the anger, the resentment, and the hurt. You can choose healing, and in that choice, you'll find the freedom you've been seeking. Forgiveness isn't about them, it's about your freedom. Forgiveness doesn't change the past, but it changes your future. It releases you from the prison of pain and anger that keeps you bound. It allows you to step into the freedom that God has prepared for you. A freedom to move forward. A freedom to live without the weight of resentment. And a freedom to experience peace. Joseph's story is one of ultimate redemption, but it's also a story of forgiveness. By choosing to forgive, Joseph broke free from the chains of his past and opened the door to restoration and reconciliation. And you can do the same. When you forgive, you set yourself free. You may never forget the pain that others caused, but you can choose to let it go. Forgiveness isn't about the other person, it's about your own healing. It's about moving forward, and it's about walking in the freedom that comes with letting go of the hurt and embracing the future that God has for you. Today, make the choice. Choose forgiveness. Choose freedom. Choose to walk in the peace that comes when you release the past and embrace the healing power of forgiveness. You're not forgiving them for their sake. You're forgiving them for your own freedom. Let go of the bitterness, let go of the anger, let go of the hurt, and step into the freedom of forgiveness. Triumph through tears. As we come to the end of this powerful journey through Joseph's life, let's take a moment to reflect on the incredible story of resilience, perseverance, and divine timing. Joseph's tears were not signs of weakness. They were the birth pains of greatness. The pain he experienced, the rejection, the betrayal, the isolation, was not in vain. It was all part of God's grand design to elevate him, to shape him into the man he was destined to be. Every tear Joseph shed was a seed being sown for the future that God had planned for him. Think about it for a moment. Joseph's journey to the throne wasn't a linear path. It wasn't a smooth ride, and it certainly wasn't easy. He went from being a favored son to being thrown into a pit by his own brothers, from being a slave in Potiphar's house to being wrongfully imprisoned. And yet, through every betrayal, every trial, and every tear, Joseph remained faithful. He endured the lowest of lows, but those very lows gave way to the highest of highs. Joseph's tears were never the end of the story. They were the catalyst for his transformation. They shaped him, molded him, and prepared him for the position God had prepared for him. Joseph didn't just survive his hardships, he was transformed by them. His tears were the river that led him to his destiny. Your tears are the same. Whatever you're going through, no matter how deep the pain, remember that your tears today are the seeds for your tomorrow's victories. The pain you feel in this moment may be preparing you for something greater than you could ever imagine. So, as you look at Joseph's story, know that the same God who was with Joseph in the pit is the same God who will be with you in your trials. He will take your tears, your pain, your losses, and turn them into something beautiful. Nothing that you go through is wasted. Even when you can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, trust that God is working behind the scenes, orchestrating a plan that will bring you to your purpose. I want to encourage you today to reflect on your own journey. Think about the challenges you've faced, the tears you've shed, and the struggles that have seemed insurmountable. Know this: your tears are not signs of weakness, they are signs of strength. They are proof that you've endured and that you've kept going even when it seemed impossible. I challenge you today to look at your life through a new lens. Don't just focus on the pain. See the potential in your tears. Every trial you face is an opportunity for growth, for maturity, for the refining process that will elevate you to the next level. Your tears today are the seeds that will yield a harvest of triumph tomorrow. Every difficult moment, every setback, every time you felt like giving up, those are the moments when God is working, preparing you for what lies ahead. You are not just surviving, you're being transformed. So I encourage you to hold on to hope. Keep going, keep fighting, keep trusting. Your tears will not last forever, but the triumph that follows will be worth it all. Joseph's tears were the birth pains of greatness. Your tears are the same. Don't let them define your weakness. Let them reveal your strength. Remember, tears are not the end of your story. They are the beginning of something powerful. God is using every tear, every struggle, every hardship to build you into the person He has destined you to be. So the next time you find yourself crying, remember that those tears are not a sign of defeat. They are the birth pains of greatness. Just as Joseph's tears led him to a place of power and purpose, your tears will lead you to your own triumph. Don't give up. Don't let your tears define your weakness. Let them reveal your strength. Keep trusting in the process, and know that your best days are still ahead of you. The victory is on the other side of your tears. You are being made ready for something greater.